The Chair recognises the honourable member for Denison.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, I also see merit in the government's bill, and I will support it. I think the government's to be applauded that, at least as far as this bill goes, the government is to be applauded for finally moving on the reform of online gambling, and with this bill in particular starting to address the problems caused by offshore online gambling sites. We've already heard from a number of speakers a number of the issues that are relevant to this debate and to this bill. For example, the prevalence of offshore sites, measured in the thousands, the way they offer games or forms of gambling which are illegal in Australia. In other words, they are not allowed to be offered by Australian gambling service providers. The way these offshore sites have rigged games will make it difficult or impossible for people to collect their winnings and so on. So it's beyond time for this reform, and I applaud the government for moving with this particular reform. There is, however, one, I think, significant deficiency in the bill, and it's a deficiency which I understand the member for Mayo will seek to address, and I'll have my own amendment as well that seeks to address it. And that is the way this bill would in fact allow the liberalisation of in-venue, in-play gambling because of the way it would allow venues like casinos or TABs to depart from the current practice of hardwired kiosks and start to offer wireless technologies within those venues. Deputy Speaker, my concern here is that it would be the start of a very slippery slope. If people could, for example, go into a casino and pick up an iPad or some other mobile device, or perhaps to download an app to put on their own mobile device, it would be a slippery slope. Before we know it, people would be saying, well, if we can do that inside the casino or the TAB, why can't we do it at the front door when we go outside for a cigarette? And if we can do it outside the front door of the casino or the TAB or whatever, well, why don't we just let people engage in-play sports betting from at home? So my concern here is that the way the bill, in fact by being silent on the definition of what sort of devices can in future be allowed for in-play betting while in venues, by being silent on a very strict definition of that, by failing to define the type of technology that will continue to be allowed for in-play betting, I do fear it effectively puts in place a foundation stone for the liberalisation of that sort of gambling. So I will be moving an amendment in the third reading, Deputy Speaker, seeking to bring clarity to what sort of technology would be allowed within venues. There's also the much bigger issue. Now, I've got to give credit again to the government and to the Minister Tudge. He has foreshadowed there will be another government bill, I assume this year, which will seek to put in place some protection for gamblers, and that's good. But we're always talking. We're always talking about that next bill. I think it's a missed opportunity today that today we're not debating a more comprehensive bill and one that addresses a number of other very important issues. I was listening to the member for Lyons here talking about the problem with gambling advertising, and he's quite right, of course. In fact, if you were to go out into the community and to ask people in the community what is the single most annoying and problematic aspect about online gambling, I think the majority would say it's the advertising. So while there's merit in all these other reforms and protections, we are ignoring the biggest single problem. The member for Lyons is quite right. There is an abundance of research showing that children are being bombarded with gambling advertising, and it is affecting their behaviour. And that is because, quite simply, because gambling advertising is actually forbidden in all and any G-rated television times, but there's an exemption for sporting events. So why on earth we allow an exemption during that time of the day when in fact many, if not most, children are watching the telly. And not only are they watching the telly, they're enthralled by a game of sport, and they're watching their sporting heroes. When they are at their most vulnerable, government regulation allows gambling advertising to occur. So I lament the fact that we're missing this opportunity in this place this week to address that issue. So I applaud the opposition for moving their own amendment, which I'll support, seeking to at least start to address the issue of gambling advertising. There's also a number of other issues, which I understand the member for Mayo is tackling some of these. Again, a missed opportunity that we could be addressing today. For example, it's actually good and commendable the way some Australian service providers do have somewhat effective self-exclusion arrangements. But the problem is, if someone has an app for one gambling house and has excluded themselves, and they're desperate for a punt, they can swipe to another app and start gambling with another service provider. So what is needed, and what I am told by the industry is technically achievable, is for a national self-exclusion database for online gambling. In other words, for one online gambling service provider, or for them all effectively to be talking to each other electronically. So when someone might reach a self-imposed limit with one service provider, or if someone has excluded themselves from one service provider, then that information would be shared in real time with other service providers, so people could be confident that the limits they had placed on themselves would in fact be in place with all Australian online gambling companies. I think that would be a really effective harm minimisation measure. And yes, there will be another bill which will look at protection of gamblers. But, you know, we've got to stop talking about this, Deputy Speaker. We could have done it all in one go at this point in time. And another issue which I'm very mindful of, and the government, and I don't think the opposition either, have shown any interest in, is a genuine crackdown on the provision of credit for gambling, and in particular the provision of credit for online gambling. I mean, yes, we are talking about service providers not being allowed to offer credit, but of course people are gambling using their credit card. So in other words, just about every person who is engaged in online gambling is enjoying the use of credit. So what's the good of saying, you know, I don't know, I won't mention any particular service provider, but what's the point of saying to service providers you can't offer a couple of $100 of credit, or $500 or $1,000 of credit, but yet we'll allow the gambler to use a credit card, perhaps with a $50,000 line of credit. I am quite influenced in what I'm saying here by people who work in the financial services and banking industries, who tell me it is actually technically quite achievable, and in fact there's already at least one Australian bank that prohibits the use of their credit cards for online gambling. So it would be possible, it would be quite easily achieved, to insist that in future people could only use some sort of debit facility when engaging with online gambling. So there are things that for the future and things for us to keep focusing on and look for areas of reform. And of course, what the Interactive Gambling Act completely ignores, what this debate today completely ignores, what all of our applauding each other for making some reform possible, what it all ignores, of course, is the other half of the problem. I mean, yes, online gambling is a big industry. It's growing rapidly, and it's reasonable to assume that with that growth is coming an increasing number of gambling addicts. But what about the other half of the equation? What about the 200,000 poker machines in this country, on which some 100,000 or so Australian gambling addicts are losing each year $4,000 or $5,000 million. I mean, we know over $10 billion is lost on the pokies each year. We know that 40% of that is lost by gambling addicts. So we know $4 or $5 billion a year is being lost by people who can't afford to lose it. But yet the government remains completely unwilling to introduce further reform in that area. The opposition is silent on the matter. I lament the fact that although the Gillard federal government did introduce some modest poker machine reform, that the Abbott government overturned those reforms and in fact overturned them with the support of the Labor Party in the Senate. It's more than a shame, it's a tragedy actually that the current Prime Minister, before he became Prime Minister, put on the record his concern about poker machine gambling addiction. He said things suggesting that he would be a reformist should he ever have the opportunity in the future. But like any number of other things, like marriage equality, climate change, here is another case where the Prime Minister has let us down, and let us down terribly. You know, we have a wonderful opportunity in this parliament with a apparently reformist-minded Prime Minister to finally do something about poker machine gambling addiction. Imagine if this parliament, the 45th parliament, was the parliament that not only introduced effective reform of online gambling, but was also the parliament that finally introduced effective reform with poker machines and introduced effective harm minimisation measures for people who gamble on poker machines. Unfortunately, I don't hold out any hope that this parliament will be the parliament to move on poker machines, and that's a shame. I am pleased to say, though, that some in the industry are trying. I was delighted to see that Wesfarmers and Coles is hoping to introduce $1 maximum bets on the 3,000 or so machines that it owns and operates through its string of hotels. I was appalled that they can't find a single Australian poker machine manufacturer who will retrofit or manufacture new machines for the implementation of that policy. What does that say about the industry? So when it comes to pokies, not only does the Liberal Party not care, not only does the Labor Party not care, but the industry doesn't care. And all the while, you know, there's some 100,000 or so Australians out there who are suffering at the hands of gambling addiction from poker machines. Mums and dads, brothers, sisters, sons and daughters, work colleagues, friends, people who often lose their job, their house, can't afford to buy their kids breakfast. We need to keep moving on that. Deputy Speaker, I'll end my speech now because I see we're almost out of time, but even though I'm a couple of minutes short of my allocated time, I will support the bill. I will also support the Labor Party amendment and the member for Mayo's amendment.
Order. I thank the member for his contribution. The debate is interrupted in accordance with Standing Order 43. The debate may be resumed at a later hour.